Okay, next question is from Sarah Harris, and she is asking about burn textures. She's doing a makeup of like a World War I soldier with some burns, like trench warfare. So there's a blast and there's some burning involved on the skin. And I wonder if you have any tips or advice for sculpting the fine detail a burn leaves on the skin as I'm struggling to create this effect. Burn textures are very, very difficult. There's a couple of things I think that would really help. One is definitely to use reference. I've got a really, really good book for burns, which is this one. I strongly recommend it if you can get hold of this. This book, I bought this, crikey, I'm trying to think what year I would have bought it. I think I bought it about 15, 20 years ago because I had like 2 burn jobs to do in 1 year. It was just a very good thing to get. So it's a good book if you can find it. If not, obviously Google will be your friend. The thing with Google, I think, is to use the search engine properly. Now, Google is a semantic search engine. So what that means is it uses the words you put in. So if you put in burn effect, you'll get all kinds of things that got nothing necessarily to do with how skin actually looks burnt. So I think what would be good would be to put into Google complications of burn injuries, types of burn injuries, treatment of burn injuries, treatment of burn trauma. If you put those kinds of terminology in, you're going to get more academic, more medical based information. And one of the things I would do would be to look up the terminology used within the treatment of burns, because if you use the right kind of wording that the medical profession uses, you're again much more likely to find correct information, and then obviously do an image search on those keywords, and then again you'll find something much more useful. Google is great for finding horrific images. It's you know, it's not nice. I don't enjoy this. I'm not a ghoul, but it's definitely very important to get primary reference. A lot of people will use pictures of other people's burn makeups as reference, and it's kind of good to see how they've been done, but I wouldn't use them as a reference per se to sculpt and do the makeup from, because if you do that, you're going to also without realizing copy their mistakes. So it's always good to go to primary reference. It's not very nice to look at, but it's definitely worth doing because you need to understand what happens to the skin. There's a couple of tricks you can do. One is to melt some gelatine. So if you can get some prosthetic gelatine, melt it down in a microwave, and then basically sort of spoon it onto a non-porous surface and let it cool down slightly. And as it's cooling, you can kind of use like a tongue stick or a spoon or something and kind of stick it into the molten gelatine and drag it out and let it cool so it strings, and it'll create all kinds of nice stringy textures as it cools down. And then you can use those textures as reference, or you can make a mold of it. So you finish this sort of stringy burn texture until the gelatin is completely solidified and cooled down. And then you can make a mold of that and then fill that mold with molten plastiline to create little sections of melted burn texture. And then what you will do is then place those sections onto a life cast or onto a flat board if you're sculpting on a flat mold, and then blend the edges out, finish those off, and then work into the texture with tools. What's nice about doing that is it kind of frees you away from that kind of blank canvas syndrome where you're starting with nothing. So it gives you something that you can then work into, and then over time you keep working, you'll change it quite radically, but it still will retain some of the initial shapes that you created randomly. Because I think sculpting is such a slow process, it's so deliberate that it can come across as very artificial looking. So it's quite nice if you can break it up with you know, these kind of create the shapes by, like I say, spooning out this gelatine to create these kind of stringy, kind of melted pizza kind of effect. And you can take that as a starting point and then flatten it as you would like, or, you know, intricate, you know, make it a bit more intricate D into it, make it more refined, but it's a good starting point. If you're going to start from scratch with the burns, again, definitely looking at reference, looking at pictures of real healed burns. What I find often with healed burn sort of scarring is that there's on any given area of skin that has this scarring, there's a few different things that can happen. One is that the skin can contract with the heat and it kind of pulls at the skin, so you may get that effect where it's pulling on something like an eye or an ear or something to pull the skin around. So that's something to consider. The other thing is to maybe remove some of the hair, because it's very common to see burn makeups where the heat has magically avoided the hairlines, and hair goes up like a tinderbox. It's very flammable. So if there's fire on the face or on the clothes that managed to burn the face, it almost certainly will have affected the hair. It will have caught, so eyebrows and hairlines and stuff can be invaded with this burn. So it's worth considering, certainly from a point of drama, to get the effect across, to get more bang for your buck, is to actually invade some of the hairlines. So you may need to flatten some of the hair down as well. But with a burn scar kind of sculpt, what I would say is to look at a good clear image of a couple of different burns, and what you'll often find is that there's 3 or 4 very definite shapes in there, sort of lines or strata within the area of the burn scarring that are very noticeable. And I would start with those, and then off of those you would then feed off smaller versions of those that kind of crisscross into it, and then off of those you'll get even smaller ones that kind of work into those. So if you sort of start with the very, very simple shapes and then gradually layer more and more complicated layers over the top, you get this sort of complexity that's born out of the simple layers lying on top of each other. So I would do that rather than try and sculpt everything at once, because it gets very, very confusing to the eye, and certainly when you're sculpting it can just muddle your brain because you've got too many of these textures and shapes to worry about, and very often they can look overdone. I think burn makeups can look really, really heavy. They sort of come out too far from the face, and often with a burn it's a reduction in, it's actually sort of burnt into the skin. So try and keep it shallow, because if it's too thick it'll look like something is on the face rather than something's burned into the face. And how you light stuff will sort of show up the textures in a more natural way than if you make something obvious and heavy in order that it gets seen. Because often I found with makeups, and I've been guilty of it myself, is they get overdone because you want to see the thing you've done, and then by definition it's not that subtle and stops looking realistic because it's very, very heavy-handed. So try and sort of dial it down to as little as you can kind of do, and it still be sort of visible. And it's very often the case that you'll do something, come in the next morning and go, do you know what, that's too heavy, and then just reduce it and take it back as much as you can. And like I say, the idea really is to add as little as possible. You don't want to have, like, you know, this much stuff on the face, because it will just look like they're wearing a pound of mincemeat on their face. And we don't want that. We want it to look like the skin has been modified, and if anything, it's kind of crept in and into the surface of the skin. So subtle, gentle, and refined is definitely the way to go, I think.